10 through 16. 1 Corinthians 2, 10 through 16. Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, "But it was to us that God revealed these things by his Spirit. For his Spirit searches out everything and shows us God's deep secrets. No one can know a person's thoughts except that person's own spirit. And no one can know God's thoughts except God's own Spirit. We have received God's Spirit, not the world's spirit, so we can know the wonderful things God has freely given us. When we tell you these things, we do not use words that come from human wisdom. Instead, we speak words given to us by the Spirit, using the Spirit's words to explain spiritual truths. But people who aren't spiritual can't receive these truths from God's Spirit. It all sounds foolish to them, and they can't understand it, for only those who are spiritual can understand what the Spirit means. Those who are spiritual can evaluate all things, but they themselves cannot be evaluated by others. For who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to teach him? But we understand these things, for we have the mind of Christ." Talk to a person you meet out in the hiking trail on Sunday mornings, and this is how they will likely describe themselves. Go out to supper with a group of workmates, and if the subject of God comes up, and this is how many will define their perspective on all things religious when you're out to supper talking to people. Hey, spend time on a dating website, and many people classify their spiritual outlook as this. What am I talking about? What phrase describes these people and many, many more in our world today? How are increasing numbers of Americans identifying themselves religiously? Well, the answer is this. It's called spiritual but not religious. Spiritual but not religious. It's actually a phrase that's decades in the making. It's nothing really new. It's come about after decades of change. It has its roots perhaps maybe back in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. A time when Americans began distrusting all things institution. A time when Americans chose to rely more upon individuality and autonomy. Power to the people. One of the phrases and one of the mantras from the 60s. Well, spiritual but not religious makes a bold statement about one's perspective on God and what it means to be a person of faith. Are you spiritual but not religious? Do you tend to have a certain mistrust of religious institutions? Are you suspicious that many faith leaders are corrupt or at least self-motivated? Are you leery about churches and television preachers asking for money? Do the formal religious routines and formalities of worship feel wooden and disconnected to you? Like you're jumping through some ceremonial hoops or some tasks to accomplish instead of connecting to something authentic within your hearts? Spiritual but not religious people usually believe that finding inner fulfillment and connection to something higher is best done on your own and in your own way. Spirituality is generally not about structured or organized churches or religions. Spiritual but not religious, it's a description to many people, and that many people are relating to more and more in our world. And what is it? What does it mean? It's also a phrase, spiritual but not religious. It's also a phrase that many entrenched church leaders and pastors and theologians and denominational heads, many despise this phrase. Many think it's an anathema. It's a curse, really. Well, why would church and faith leaders despise this phrase? Shouldn't they support such a thing? It's, after all, people are finding spirituality in their lives. And indeed, spirituality, make no mistake, spirituality is alive and well in our culture. It hasn't really gone anywhere. many people are seeking an inner sense of a higher power or greater consciousness in their lives. Well, here's the rub with church leadership. Oftentimes, the problem that church leadership have with this kind of a movement is that these people that are spiritual but not religious, they're often not choosing to find such a spiritual connection within established religious organizations or churches. It means they don't show up. They don't come to our services and such. They don't come and participate in our establishments. Is this you? Probably, at least to some extent, it is. It probably is. Back in the late 50s and early 60s, a full 70% of Americans regularly attended religious services held in established churches and houses of worship. And just a handful of decades later, the number has dropped through the floor. And even those that still do affiliate with organized religious movements and institutions, they do so in a much less committed way. Rather than being loyal to the church or the denomination of your heritage or your family's heritage, those that still attend services and church services and worship services, they more often pick and choose when and where they would like to go, no matter what, wherever is best suited for them, wherever they wish to participate, and to what extent they wish to participate too. Often taking or leaving whatever they want about church, taking what they like and leaving behind what they don't particularly care for. This movement, this spiritual but not religious movement, is affecting most everyone. Even many devout followers of Jesus, they say it in this way. They say, we love Jesus, but we kind of hate the church. And in some ways, I think, well, I understand why. So therefore, they practice their faith on their own terms and in their own ways, apart from imposed structure of pastors and leaders and programs and buildings and all the drama that can happen within congregations. No, it never happens, right? Yeah, drama, church drama. Who loves that? Well, every church has it. I mean, we scratch our heads and wonder why sometimes people aren't showing up. Well, because they don't want any more. No, who wants more drama in their life anyway? I don't know. Well, in short, we are choosing our faith for ourselves as we see fit. And there is no stopping this change. I'm not going to do a thing about it. As a matter of fact, it's just going to change us as it already has been changing all of us in past decades. I think we're all becoming spiritual, but not religious. Know it or not, we are. And if you think about it, you might be in good company. Because there's been countless people who have stood against the establishment, bucking the controlling powers that be. And these people have claimed that the only true spirituality is your own spirituality that you have in your heart. I think the most famous of these, you could make an argument for this, the most famous of these is Jesus. Jesus redefined and reinterpreted the faith and the scriptures. He cleared the temple. He challenged authority. He bucked the system. He dismantled the establishment, and he went his own way. Others more in our own time, I think of Martin Luther King Jr., celebrating him tomorrow as a national holiday. He again dismantled the establishment. Sadly paid the price for that on April 4th, 1968. But it didn't quiet him. It didn't quiet him at all. As a matter of fact, it set him free. And the movement that he gave his life to was set free on that day too. It's his spiritual journey. Perhaps perhaps few in the history of Christianity have dismantled the religious establishment more than the Apostle Paul. If the Apostle Paul were to have used Match.com dating site back in his day, which I don't think he would have, but say he did back in that day, I think he would have listed spiritual but not religious as his religious descriptor. Honestly, if you read his writings, he really didn't have any interest in dating or marriage in his life, but yet still if he did, I think he would have done that. Anyway, let's look at verse 10 of what he had to say. But it was to us that God revealed these things by his Spirit. For his Spirit searches out everything and shows us God's deep secrets. Notice what he's saying here. Notice what he's not saying. Did God reveal these things to the religious leaders? Or to the priests? Or to the temple leaders? No. These revelations that Paul is talking about came direct to Paul and his fellow believers through God's Spirit. Spirituality, but not religious. And again, listen to his words even further in verse 11. No one can know a person's thoughts except that person's own spirit. And no one can know God's thoughts except God's own Spirit. Verse 12, and we have received God's Spirit, not the world's spirit, so we can know the wonderful things God has freely given us. There's no need for institutions and establishments and hierarchies to be spiritual. This comes directly from God to us. And no board of directors or ecclesiastical magisterium can tell us otherwise. Because it's right direct to us. Verse 15, Paul says it so clearly. Those who are spiritual can evaluate all things, but they themselves cannot be evaluated by others. In other words, you own your own spirituality. It's yours. Do you realize this? Do you realize this reality? None of us should rely upon leaders and churches and religious institutions for our spirituality. That is not the intent. And don't look to me for your spiritual connection. Have you ever noticed that I never tell you what to believe? Did you ever notice that? I don't. I always leave it up to you. Because it's not my job to tell you what to believe. And if I did tell you what to believe, even if you said you believed it, you wouldn't. Because what you believe is already right in there. I remember going to a church when I was in my youth, my teen years, and we'd go there 2 times a week for a service. Sunday morning, you get the midweek service, and pastor preached on good and hard for about 45 minutes to an hour. Two times a week of indoctrination. 2 times a week of propaganda. Looking back. This is what you should believe. This is how you should believe it. And this is what is real and true. Anyone else ever been there? And maybe you grew up in the Catholic Church with CCD. I did that too. This is what you need to believe. This is the truth. And after years of such indoctrination, you might actually say, or maybe actually you're even convinced that you believe it all, but you really don't. You've just been told so many times. It's like you relent and say, yeah, that's the truth, I guess. Well, this is what the Bible says, the pastors and the priests say. And I say, okay, but that's what you think it says. I might think it says something different. By the way, I'm never going to tell you what to believe and how to be spiritual. So if you're looking for that from me, sorry. But I will encourage you, always and every time, I will encourage you to look inside and find your faith that's in there. It's called the Spirit. And I will encourage you to no end to find that and connect with it inside of you. Everybody should do that for themselves. But there are many faith leaders and priests and pastors and board members that hate this. Why? Because honestly, there goes control. There goes control. The easiest way to control people, this is true, the easiest way to control people is to hold the keys to spirituality and the keys to God. And the leaders that hold these keys become the necessary link. You need them. I'm here to tell you, you don't. Denominations and churches and pastors have long established rules and doctrines and theologies and traditions that are layers and layers deep, whether it's canon law or systematic theology or Sharia law. It crosses all religions. The intent is to corral and to organize the people under a rigid structure that keeps them in control. Because if you can dictate the beliefs and keep everyone believing in these beliefs, and keeping them believing that you are the keeper of these beliefs, then you can keep them right here. And sadly, that's where many have been, and that's sadly where many remain. Nothing new, really. This has been happening since time immemorial. Centuries and centuries of this, and places of worship, and whole major religions do this. And indeed, it still happens now in churches and congregations, even in our day and age, believe it or not, and other houses of worship. You ever notice that churches only want more and more people to come to their church? Did you ever notice that? They never want to give people away to other churches, do they? They never want to help other churches let us help you. Let us, here's some people for you. Here, how can we help you grow your church? No, they want people for themselves. Why? Because they want to grow their church. Because that's most important to them. After all, the leaders of those churches have the truth, and don't question the truth. Don't question the truth that the leaders have as they fill their parishioners full of their dogma and propaganda, saying, believe this truth. Believe this truth, they say. Adhere to it, or else. Or else what, you might ask. And they say, or else I just wouldn't want to be you. Fear is by far the best mechanism for such control. It's no wonder. Look, maybe I'm just Gen X, and this is how I think. I'm anti-establishment because of my generation. I can't help it. I didn't create my generation or my culture. I am just what I am because I'm a part of the culture that I live in. I wonder if this is why we're all becoming spiritual but not religious. Because of this type of stuff that happens and has happened and continues to happen. It's no wonder that we are. In my mind, question everything. Take charge of your own spirituality. You don't need leaders and churches and denominations and institutions to tell you how to do it. You choose the how and the when and in the what way and what it means to you. Some people still say, just tell me what to believe. I just want to know what to believe. Why? Find it yourself. Why do you just want to be spoon-fed something to believe? Find it yourself so it's yours. Honestly, really. And think about it this way. Do people really think that they're going to fool God? Do people really think that they're going to fool God? Like someday when we stand before God, are we going to say, God, I believe this and this and this and this? And God's going to say, really? Do you really believe that, or did someone just tell you to say that to me at this moment? Give yourself permission to believe what you really do believe. It's okay. Whatever it is, give yourself permission to believe it. As a matter of fact, give yourself permission to find out what you actually believe in your own heart. Find your connection to spirituality. A lot of pastors and priests won't tell you this. Why? Well, sometimes they just need to make everyone believe what they do. You got to believe this and this because this is what is truth. Well, it's truth according to them. Or maybe many of them just really have this deep desire to keep their churches full because it boosts their fragile egos. Or they have a Jesus complex and they want to save the world single-handedly, so they think they can do that by making everyone be exactly like them. Or more often than not, they just like power and control. And sadly, that's a truth within a lot of pastors and priests. Don't believe me? Go test it. Because I think I'm right. But don't take my word for it. Go find out for yourself. Indeed, so many already have. They call themselves spiritual, but not religious. All through the history of Christianity, even from the beginning of the faith, people have found new moments of following that spirit within, that inner compass that we talked about last time. And it's a new, brand new thing within people, or a new thing within groups of people. But then something always happens afterwards. The same thing happened even at the beginning of Christianity. This fresh new spirituality, well, then it starts to, after being fresh, it starts to organize itself. And then it starts to structuralize itself. And then it starts to institutionalize itself. Soon spirituality becomes religion. And religion becomes controlling. And it begins to serve itself instead of helping people find their own way to God. Rules and doctrines and theologies replace what we are supposed to have. Well, what are we supposed to have? The Apostle Paul says it like this: we have the mind of Christ. You have the mind of Christ. But so often we willingly give that up. We give it over to those who say that they know, or that they have the right beliefs or the right way, and we must follow them if we want to be a part of God. Throughout history, people have risen up to challenge such things, time and time again. Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, he stood up to the Christian institution that existed in his day, the universal church, and he said, let the people decide themselves how they follow Christ. Let them decide themselves. And so came the great Protestant Reformation. Well, many times this kind of thing has happened. People have experienced the mind of Christ and a higher connection within, and they've broken free of religion, free to understand, free to know the truth themselves, and to be set free by the truth that they know. But like so many new expressions and movements, they tend to repeat the same life cycle over and over again, constructing the very same walls that existed before. An example of this is one of the most influential leaders of the great Protestant Reformation, and indeed one of the most influential leaders in Christianity of all time. His name was John Calvin. Calvin lived right around the time of Martin Luther, and he was a master theologian, Calvin was. He organized what he thought was a Christian utopia in Geneva, Switzerland. He was instrumental in the great breaking free of the religious structures of his day. But ironically, in breaking free, he just simply reestablished another version of the same thing. But of course, his theology was the right theology. Don't question it. Well, apparently, Michael Servetus The theologian Michael Servetus didn't get that memo. And he felt very much at liberty to critique and openly criticize some of Calvin's doctrine. He disagreed specifically with Calvin's doctrine of the Trinity and of infant baptism. Servetus was a brilliant man, a Renaissance man, as we would call him. He was a theologian, a medical doctor. He was an artist. He was an expert in many, many sciences, etc., etc. He was gifted spiritually. And he was on his own spiritual journey. And establishments don't like this. Well, Calvin was so convinced of his own doctrine, his own dogma, and how right it was, he had no problem ensuring the death of someone who disagreed. Calvin was openly in support and most responsible for burning this heretic Servetus at the stake because he disagreed with Calvin's theology. Think of the irony of that. To be fair, it wasn't uncommon for this type of a thing back then. Heresy at that time still was punishable by death, even in the Christian faith. I mean, we don't kill anybody anymore for disagreeing with our beliefs or our theologies. We just politely tell them maybe that they're going to hell. We figure that's pretty much bad enough. And, eternal damnation is pretty much the ultimate killing, I guess. But you can see all throughout history the same pattern repeating itself over and over again, and certainly not just in religious spheres. Look at the state of politics in our nation. Despite all of our beliefs in individual liberty and freedom and democracy, our current day is no exception with the neo-tribalism of competing ideologies. Camps and tribes building walls and closing gates on both sides. We have the truth, they say, one camp says. If you follow them over there, we're going to become fascist or communist or both. No, another party says we have the truth. And if you listen to them over there, democracy is going to collapse. Everyone has the truth, don't they? And everyone has something to say about the others. Endlessly, all they do, and this is all we do in the world of politics and other places, we endlessly parrot what we've heard from other people. That's all we do. We just repeat back what someone's told us to say. I mean, honestly, how can people not see this? Does no one see this? And, what? We're going to lose democracy. Or we're going to become fascist or communist. I mean, no one really knows what they're talking about. They're just repeating what they've heard so many times over and over again, drilled into their heads by people that say this is the truth. It sounds a lot like religion, and religion sounds a lot like politics because they're very similar to one another. They're very similar in nature. They both have been the great social organizers throughout history. And we charge on ahead, no matter what camp we're in, no matter what tribe we're in. We're like huge herds of wildebeests charging across the savannah. No idea why we're stampeding or where we're going. We're just charging ahead. We've got the truth. No, we've got the truth. And running headfirst into each other. For what? For what? But spirituality is so different than that. Spirituality is nothing like that. A spiritual journey is an individual trek to a unique place that is meant just for you. It's not about following with the herds blindly running along. It's about a whole sense of individual connection. Individual health. It's about mind and body and spirit. It breaks out of norms and breaks free from boundaries and rules and rigid doctrines. It actually rejects such things. It's a progressive state of being where you follow something so much deeper than that. And what you follow is so much more personal than theologies or rules or doctrines or dogma. Instead of religion and queuing everyone up behind a set of propositions to be brainwashed by, being spiritual means that you follow something within you. You follow a person within. And for those who share the Christian faith, that person within is the Spirit of Jesus. How do you follow Jesus? Just like Paul said, we have the mind of Christ. How do you follow that mind? You ask the Spirit within you. And then you listen. What is the Spirit telling you? You have the mind of Christ. You do for you. It's not your pastor. It's not your priest. It's not your church or your religion or your spouse or your parents or your grandparents. You have the mind of Christ in you. You have that compass within. Find your spirituality, not anybody else's. Find your connection to the Spirit within you. Go in peace. Amen.